My sexist husband mistreated and humiliated me in front of my entire family. You're nothing without me. Things are done my way here. Remember, I pay for everything. He yelled at me, saying I was a burden to him. Until one day, I got tired of all his humiliations and decided to give him back all his poison in the worst way possible, where it would hurt him the most. Anna was in the kitchen, calmly drying a glass that was already completely clean. Her hand movements were slow, almost automatic, as if the act of cleaning allowed her to maintain control over something in her life. Outside, the night moved along with a light rain tapping against the windows, filling the atmosphere with a constant and peaceful murmur. But inside her, a storm was brewing. From the living room came the sound of the TV, where her husband, Victor, was watching the news as he did every night. She couldn't see his face, but she imagined the usual indifferent expression in his eyes and the hard line of his mouth. His presence in the house was constant, a shadow that oppressed her without the need for words or gestures. As she placed the glass in the drainer, she remembered the last argument they'd had, just a few days ago. There were no shouts or blows, but every word he directed at her was laced with a contained aggression, almost more hurtful than any insult. "How long are you going to keep complaining, Anna?" he had said with disdain when she tried to express her exhaustion. "I give you everything you need, so stop acting like you're the victim here. If you're unhappy, it's because you've brought it on yourself." Victor's words replayed in her mind like a broken song, wearing her down little by little. For years, she had tried to convince herself that the problem was within her, that it was her fault if he showed no interest or empathy, that perhaps he was right in seeing her as someone incapable. But recently, something within her had begun to awaken, something that told her she deserved more than a life full of silence and resentment. She placed the cloth on the countertop and took a deep breath. She felt a weight in her chest and the knot in her throat that appeared every time she tried to express herself, to find the right words to tell Victor how she felt. But what was the use? He looked at her as if she had no right to question anything, as if her presence was more of a service than a companionship. At that moment, her phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from Laura, her lifelong friend, the only person she felt she could truly be herself with. "Are you okay? You know I'm here if you need to talk," read Laura's message, brief but full of the empathy she so missed in her daily life. Anna looked at the message for several seconds before replying. She knew Laura was worried, that she had started to notice the weight she carried in her eyes and the way she seemed to have faded little by little. Although she hadn't shared the magnitude of what she was living at home, the times they had gone out recently, her friend had sensed a sadness in her that went beyond the little, everyday complaints. "Thank you, Laura. Sometimes I just want to disappear from here," she finally replied, not daring to say more. Sending the message made her feel vulnerable, but it also relieved a small part of the burden she carried. Laura replied almost immediately, "You're not alone. If you need help, if you feel like you can't take it anymore, I'll support you in whatever you decide. Remember that." Laura's words lingered in her mind. They reminded her that, although she felt trapped in this life of constant humiliations, there was always a way out. But fear kept her anchored. The fear of what her family would say, of what people in her small community would say, and even of how Victor might react if he found out she was considering escaping his control. Anna was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't hear Victor enter the kitchen until he was beside her. He looked at her with an expression somewhere between curious and annoyed, as if her mere presence in that room made him uncomfortable. "Who are you talking to?" he asked, making no effort to hide his accusatory tone. Anna swallowed and tried to keep her composure. "With Laura." She asked if everything was okay. Victor scoffed, crossing his arms and looking at her with a sarcastic smile. "And what did you tell her? That your life is so horrible? You should be grateful for what you have, Anna. How many women would be happy to have what you have?" She felt the heat rise to her cheeks, a reflection of the frustration she was trying to contain. She tried to defend herself, even though she knew it would be useless. "I'm not speaking badly about you, Victor. I'm just talking to a friend." He stepped forward, lowering his voice to a cold tone. "Oh, really? Well, you'd better remember who pays for all of this. The next time you want to cry to someone about your problems, remember you're nothing without me." His eyes, dark and piercing, challenged her to respond. Anna felt a knot in her stomach. She had heard those words so many times she almost believed them. "You're nothing without me. You should be grateful. If you're unhappy, it's your fault." Those phrases had accompanied her for years, consuming her little by little, stealing her voice until it was reduced to a whisper. Victor returned to the living room, leaving her alone in the kitchen, but the echo of his words continued to resonate in the room. Anna leaned against the edge of the counter, trying to control the tears that threatened to escape. This time, however, something changed. Instead of despair, she felt a spark of something different. She could no longer allow him to have that power over her, for her life to depend on the approval of someone who only sought to hurt her. With trembling hands, she took her phone again and sent a message to Laura. "I need to get out of here, but I don't know how. I can't take it anymore." A few seconds later, her friend's response arrived. "The first thing is you're not alone, Anna. Talk to me whenever you can. I'll help you find a way out. You deserve to be happy, and you don't have to live like this." Anna looked at those words with a mix of fear and hope. It was as if, by writing that message, she had started to build the first step of a staircase towards her freedom. That thought gave her strength. She knew the path would be long, that she would face challenges and difficult decisions. But for the first time in years, she felt there could be a possibility of a different life, one where she could be herself without fear of repercussions. She closed her eyes, imagining for a moment a life where she didn't constantly have to ask herself if she deserved love and respect. And at that moment, she made a silent promise. She would no longer be silent. She would not allow her voice to be silenced. She knew she would have to face many fears, that the world might judge her, and that Victor would try to make her believe she was wrong. But finally, she had understood that freedom was more important than fear, and that no matter how long she had been trapped, it was never too late to start again. And that night, in the silence of the kitchen, while the rain continued to gently fall against the window, Anna decided her story would not end there. Anna woke up before dawn, her heart racing and her mind full of thoughts. The words of her friend Laura kept echoing in her head. "You deserve to be happy, and you don't have to live like this." She felt a mix of fear and hope that kept her from staying still. She got up, quietly heading to the kitchen, afraid of waking Victor, who was sleeping deeply in the bedroom. The house was steeped in an almost unreal silence. Anna made herself a cup of tea, trying to calm the anxiety that coursed through her body. She looked around, fixing her gaze on the familiar objects that had represented stability and, at the same time, the prison of her life. She thought of everything she had sacrificed to keep her marriage, to avoid confronting the reality of a relationship that had slowly consumed her. Her phone suddenly vibrated, and when she looked at the screen, she saw another message from Laura. "I'm coming over to see you. I know it's early, but I think you need to talk about this face-to-face." Anna felt a wave of relief. Laura was her refuge, the only person who seemed to understand the depth of her suffering, even when Anna herself doubted what she felt. She replied with a brief, "Yes, I'll be waiting," and prepared for what would be the most important conversation of her life. Half an hour later, as the sky began to lighten, Laura arrived. She had a serene expression that conveyed a calm Anna hadn't felt in a long time. She invited her in and served her a cup of hot tea. Laura sat across from her and looked at her in silence for a few seconds, giving her time to find the words. "Anna, what made you decide?" she finally asked softly. Anna looked at the tea in her hands, watching as the small clouds of steam dissipated into the air. "I'm not sure it was a decision, at least, not one I made all at once," she answered, her voice barely a whisper. "It's something that's been growing inside me. I feel tired, but not in the usual way. It's a deep exhaustion, Laura. It hurts to exist like this." Laura nodded, her gaze full of empathy. "I understand, Anna. You've been living in a relationship that consumes you and never allows you to be yourself. But I want you to know that the first step to changing that you've already taken. You've acknowledged your pain and what you need. That's not easy, you know?" Anna looked up and saw in her friend's eyes the understanding she had longed for. For years, she had thought that no one could understand her, that her suffering was invisible to the world. But there was Laura, listening to her and reminding her that she was not alone. Victor wouldn't understand, Anna said with a sigh, more to herself than to Laura. To him, I'm a burden, a nuisance. He's told me that so many times that I think, in a way, I started to believe it too. Laura reached out and took her hand gently. You're not a burden, Anna. You're a woman with dreams, with courage, with a life that deserves to be lived fully. But Victor has made you believe the opposite, and that's not love. He's used your fears to keep you under his control, and that's something you have to leave behind, even if it's hard. Anna felt her eyes fill with tears. For the first time in years, someone was telling her that she had the right to live differently, that she deserved a dignified life. It was a truth she had always known deep down, but Laura's words had brought it to the surface. And how do you do that, Laura? She asked in a barely audible voice. How do you leave an entire life behind? Laura took a deep breath, as if searching for the right words. It's not about forgetting what you've lived, Anna. It's about starting to build something new, little by little. You don't have to have all the answers now. You just have to take the next step, the one that makes you feel safer. And, if you want, you don't have to do it alone. I'll be here to help you with whatever you need. At that moment, Anna felt as if the weight of years, of wounds and fears, began to lift. It was as if a small flame of hope was kindling inside her, giving her a clarity she had never had before. Then, Anna whispered, her throat tight, I suppose I need to start by protecting myself. Maybe I need to find a place to go if things get worse. Laura nodded with an encouraging smile. That's a good first step. There are organizations that help women in your situation, Anna. They can provide emotional and legal support and even a safe place. If you decide to do this, you can count on them and, of course, on me. Anna's heart was beating fast. The idea of leaving her home, of leaving the life she had built with Victor, scared her deeply. But she also felt, for the first time, that freedom was within reach. The conversation with Laura had given her a new perspective and the courage she needed to imagine a different future. Suddenly, they heard the sound of the front door opening. They looked at each other, their hearts pounding. It was Victor. It wasn't part of the plan for him to find her in the middle of a conversation with Laura, especially when the topic was so delicate. Victor entered the kitchen, his usual frown in place, and his gaze went from Anna to Laura with distrust. What are you doing up so early? He asked in a tone that made it clear he didn't approve of Laura's visit. Anna felt her body tense. The old feeling of fear and submission threatened to return, but this time, with an effort of will, she forced herself to stay firm. Laura came to have tea with me, Victor. There's nothing wrong with that, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. He let out a dry, sarcastic laugh, crossing his arms. Oh, really? Having tea? Don't you have anything better to do, Anna? And you, he said, looking at Laura with disdain, maybe you should learn not to interfere in other people's lives. Laura looked at him unfazed, and her voice, calm but firm, broke the silence that Victor's hostility had created. Victor, Anna is my friend, and as such, I can be with her whenever she needs me. I don't see anything wrong with that, Laura said, challenging him with a calmness that left Anna in awe. Victor pursed his lips and stared at Anna. I hope you're not filling her head with nonsense, Anna. You know people have an image of us. It's best to keep things as they are. Trust me, he added with a cold, calculating smile, a veiled threat that Anna understood perfectly. Laura stood up, giving Anna's hand a squeeze before heading to the door. Anna, whenever you want, you know where to find me. Don't forget that you always have options. With those words, Laura left, leaving Anna alone with Victor. For a few seconds, silence reigned. Victor looked at her, his expression of disdain growing more intense by the second. What do you think you're doing, Anna? He asked coldly. Anna took a deep breath, feeling that this moment was crucial. I'm not doing anything wrong, Victor. I need a little time for myself, she said, finding a courage in her words that surprised her. He let out a scornful laugh. Time for yourself? He repeated with disdain. You're pathetic, Anna. Do you really think you have anything without me? Take all the time you want, but remember, at the end of the day, you have nothing without me. His words were venomous, but this time, Anna felt that they no longer had the same effect. Laura's words, filled with encouragement and hope, resonated louder than Victor's aggression. This was the first step, small but significant, toward the life she knew she deserved. In silence, she walked to her room, leaving Victor's words behind and taking with her the firm decision not to let him extinguish the small spark of hope that Laura had helped to ignite. The next day, Anna stood by the window in her room, looking out onto the street that was still empty under the faint morning sun. The silence in the house was deep, an almost ironic contrast to the turmoil forming in her mind. Victor's words still echoed in her head, but this time, it wasn't just his threats occupying her thoughts. Now, alongside them, Laura's words also rang, "You always have options." That phrase felt like a distant echo, but also a whisper full of hope, one that made her believe, for the first time in years, that her life could be different. With that thought in mind, she decided to seek help from an organization Laura had mentioned in their last conversation. She opened her computer with trembling hands and started searching for information. She found the website of a local association offering support to women in situations of emotional and psychological abuse. It took her a few minutes to gather the courage to fill out the online form, in which she briefly described her situation, avoiding painful details, but trying to be honest about her situation. A few moments after sending the form, her phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number, greeting her kindly and offering an appointment for a confidential consultation. Anna felt a knot in her stomach, but also a strange sense of relief. Taking this step felt like a betrayal to the life she had known, but it was also a promise of something greater, her freedom. The next day, she found herself walking to the address they had given her. The place was a small, simple building with a welcoming look, a wooden door, and a discreet sign. That place was filled with hope for so many women like her. Upon entering, she was greeted by a woman with a warm smile and calm eyes, who invited her to sit in a small waiting room decorated with soft colors and peaceful paintings. "Welcome, Anna," the woman said, shaking her hand. "I'm Marta, and I want you to know you're in a safe place. Here you can speak freely." Anna felt the knot in her throat begin to loosen. She silently thanked this gesture, as she hadn't felt security or support in a long time. She sat in a chair next to Marta, who began the session by gently asking about her situation. "Would you like to tell me how you got here?" Marta asked in a calm voice. Anna hesitated for a moment, searching for the words that could describe what her life had been like in recent years. "My husband, he's a complicated man," she began, her voice trembling. "He wasn't always like this. At first, he was kind, attentive. He made me feel important. But little by little, things changed. His words started to get cold, and every time I tried to express what I felt, he made me feel that everything was my fault." Marta listened attentively without interrupting, allowing her the time to open up. Anna felt like she had finally found someone who was willing to understand her pain without judgment. Over time, Anna continued. Looking down at her hands, he started controlling everything. From what I wore to who I could talk to. Every time I tried to do something for myself, he reminded me that I was nothing without him. And she paused, her voice breaking. I think at some point, I started to believe him. Marta nodded with understanding and spoke softly. "Anna, it's very common for people in your situation to start doubting themselves. Emotional manipulation can be as damaging as any other kind of abuse. But it's important for you to know that this control he has over you is not something you deserve, and you're not alone in this." Those words resonated deeply with Anna. The way Marta described her situation gave her a perspective she had never considered. For years, she had thought her pain was only the result of her own failings, that if she changed, Victor would too. Now, she was beginning to understand that he had created that narrative to maintain control over her. "And what can I do now?" Anna asked, feeling vulnerable and, at the same time, eager to find a way out. Marta smiled with understanding and spoke calmly. "Anna, the most important thing is not to rush. You have the right to take the time you need to decide what you want to do. There are resources and support to help you at each step. The first thing you need is to start strengthening your support network, your friends, trusted people. And remember, we are here to help you every step of the way." Anna felt a warmth in her chest upon hearing those words. The idea of strengthening a support network, of surrounding herself with people who truly cared about her, gave her hope. Images of Laura, always present, always ready to listen to her, came to her mind. Her friend had been her salvation in those dark moments, and now it was clear to her that it was time to let more people help her heal. Returning home, she felt lighter. For the first time, she felt that she could see life from a different perspective, one where she herself had the power to decide her future. However, that peace was interrupted when she opened her front door and found Victor standing in the living room with a dark, tense expression. "Where were you, Anna?" he asked in a cold tone, as if every word was loaded with a latent threat. Anna froze for a moment, but remembering Marta's words, she felt that the confidence she had started to build would not crumble so easily. "I went for a walk," she replied, without adding further details. Victor looked at her suspiciously, his eyes scrutinizing each of her gestures. There was something in his expression that indicated he wasn't satisfied with her answer, but he also seemed to realize that Anna had no intention of saying more. "I hope you don't think about talking about things that are nobody's business," he finally said, with a tone that pretended to be casual but was full of insinuations. Anna looked at him intently, noticing how that phrase he always used to intimidate her didn't affect her the same way this time. Something inside her had strengthened, a small spark that Victor could not extinguish. "You don't need to worry about me, Victor," she said with a calm she hadn't known she had. "I can take care of my own matters." For the first time, she saw a slight expression of surprise on her husband's face. He seemed puzzled, as if he couldn't understand how she, after so many years, was beginning to show a strength he had tried to suppress. Victor opened his mouth as if to say something else, but finally remained silent and retreated to his office, leaving her alone. That night, Anna lay in bed feeling a mixture of emotions, fear, hope, and a strength she had never experienced before. She knew the road ahead would be complicated, and there would be moments of uncertainty, but she also understood that each step brought her closer to her freedom. Before closing her eyes, she sent a message to Laura, briefly telling her about the session she had had with Marta and about how, for the first time in years, she felt she was finding her own voice. Laura responded immediately, "I'm so proud of you, Anna. Remember, no matter what happens, never let anyone make you doubt your worth. You deserve to be happy." Those words were like a balm to her soul. She allowed herself to smile, feeling that her life was beginning to take a direction no longer dictated by fear, but by the genuine desire to live a full and peaceful life. With that thought, Anna fell asleep, knowing that, for the first time, tomorrow could bring something other than shadows. The next day, Anna took a deep breath as she settled into the car seat, feeling a mix of revulsion and resignation. Victor drove in silence, his expression cold and unbothered, and Anna stared out the window, watching the scenery blur as they got closer to her parents' house. Family gatherings were a ritual Victor forced her to attend, and although she preferred not to go, she knew that refusing would only make things worse. When they arrived, Anna saw her brother's cars, Marcos and Daniel, parked outside. Inside, she was welcomed by the familiar smell of her mother's homemade food, always prepared with the expectation that everyone would enjoy it in silence, with no questions or arguments. Everything had to be kept in that rigid atmosphere, where each person's role seemed set in stone. Her mother, a woman with a tired look and quick movements, greeted her with a brief hug, as always, without time for conversation. Her father was in the living room, sitting in his leather chair, his throne for years. He was a man of few words, but his imposing presence had dictated the house rules since Anna could remember. With one look, he could keep any family member, especially the women, in line. Anna's brothers, seated with an air of superiority at the table, greeted her with a smug smile. Both were tall and strong, with an authority that seemed more a reflection of their father than something genuine. They had grown up under the same roof, in the same environment as Anna, but their fate had been different. Both had embraced the machismo their father instilled in them, wearing their role as men like a badge of pride. "It's about time you got here," Marcos commented mockingly as he patted Victor on the back as if he were part of his team. Anna avoided her brother's gaze and sat at the table while the others settled around. Her brother's wives, Sonia and Carmina, sat with blank expressions and downcast eyes, reflecting the emotional exhaustion they shared without words. Anna noticed the faint marks on Carmina's wrists, which she had tried to hide with bracelets. She knew what they meant, although they never spoke of it aloud. "Well, we're all here," her father said in his authoritarian tone, looking at each person to make sure no one would interrupt him. "It's good to see the family together, isn't it?" Anna held back a grimace and nodded, knowing that any sign of discontent could trigger a withering look from her father or, worse, Victor's displeasure, who continued to control her even at family gatherings. "Anna, how are things with Victor?" her mother asked in a neutral tone, as if it were just a simple greeting with no sensitivity. Victor smiled, taking control of the conversation as usual. "Everything's fine. Anna is a good wife. She knows how to behave," he said with a smug look that made Marcos and Daniel share a chuckle. Victor's words hit Anna like a cold shock, and her gaze briefly met Sonia's, who pressed her lips together, clearly uncomfortable. She knew they shared the same fate, a life marked by silence and submission to men who believed their power was unquestionable. Trying to get through the situation, Anna began serving herself some food, but her hands trembled slightly. Marcos, always attuned to details, noticed her nervousness and didn't miss the chance to comment on it. "Wow, Anna, feeling nervous or what?" "No need to. We're family," he said, his tone laced with malicious mockery. Anna felt her cheeks flush, but she tried to stay calm. "No, I'm fine. Just a bit tired," she replied, trying to avoid the spotlight. Sonia, seated beside her, gently patted her hand, a gesture of solidarity that almost went unnoticed. They both knew they didn't have many opportunities to speak openly, but these small acts of silent support had become their way of staying strong. The conversation continued, with the men talking about work and soccer, while the women simply listened, neither interrupting nor intervening. However, in her mind, Anna was beginning to question more and more whether she should continue being part of that charade. The conversation she had with Marta at the association and Laura's constant support had given her a new perspective. She could live differently. But sitting at that table, surrounded by men who mirrored the same abusive pattern as her father, made her doubt if she could ever truly escape. At one point during the gathering, her father shot a hard look at Sonia, who hadn't smiled throughout the entire meal. "Sonia, what's wrong with you? Can't you smile for your husband anymore?" he said, with a tone full of disdain. Sonia lowered her gaze, as if an invisible force kept her from standing up for herself. Carmina squeezed her friend's hand in silence, showing her support. Anna felt a contained fury grow inside her. She had spent years watching her father and brothers control, humiliate, and suppress the women in her family, and at that moment, she realized she could no longer be complicit in that system of abuse. Anna took a deep breath and, without planning it, raised her voice. "Sonia doesn't have to smile if she doesn't want to," she said, her voice resonating through the dining room. "None of us have to do it to satisfy anyone." The silence at the table was immediate. All eyes turned to her, surprised. No one, especially her father, expected Anna, the quietest and most submissive of them all, to dare to raise her voice. Victor looked at her with a frown, his dark eyes full of warning. But Anna, this time, did not lower her gaze. "And since when do you think you can talk like that, Anna?" her father said coldly, trying to exert the same control he had had over her all her life. Anna looked at him, facing him with a confidence she didn't know she had. "Since I realized I don't have to stay silent to please others," she replied, her voice firm. "I don't have to be the woman you or Victor or any of my brothers expect. I won't live my life by those rules." Her mother looked at her with a mixture of fear and worry, but in the faces of Sonia and Carmina, there was a spark of admiration. Anna's words had broken a silence that had been the norm for years. She knew there would be consequences for that outburst, but she felt it was a necessary step, a statement made not just for herself, but also for the others. Her father looked at her with disbelief and pressed his lips together. "Well, it seems you've filled your head with strange ideas," he muttered with contempt. "Maybe you should remember your place, Anna. No one here wants to hear your nonsense." Anna felt a mix of fear and freedom. She knew the tension would only worsen if she kept insisting, but she also understood that she couldn't turn back now. In some way, she was breaking a tradition of abuse and control that had defined her life and that of the women in her family. "I'm not talking nonsense, Dad. I'm just telling the truth," she finally said, her voice clear and steady. Silence fell over the table again, but Anna felt that moment had marked a definitive change. She had challenged the authority of her father and her brothers, and although she knew things wouldn't change overnight, she had planted a seed. Perhaps over time, those words would bloom in Sonia and Carmina's lives and in her own. When the gathering ended, Anna left that house with a mixture of fear and hope. That act of bravery reminded her that the power of her voice was real, and that even though the path was uncertain, each step brought her closer to a life where no one could silence her. That night, Anna could barely sleep. She lay awake in the darkness of her room, feeling the echo of her own words resonate in her mind. "I don't have to be the woman that you, Victor, or any of my brothers expect." That sentence, spoken in the midst of that family gathering, had become a declaration of war against everything that had limited her. She still felt a mixture of fear and adrenaline for having stood up to her father and brothers, but above all, she felt a new, deep pride that pushed her to keep going. In the morning, as she prepared breakfast in the kitchen, she heard Victor's footsteps approaching. She knew he was also unhappy with her attitude at the gathering, and although she tried to stay calm, her intuition told her that a confrontation was inevitable. Victor entered the kitchen with a cold expression that felt like an invisible blow. He looked at her with those dark, calculating eyes he seemed to use as a weapon to intimidate her. "So, you think you're very brave now, don't you, Anna?" he said with an ironic tone, taking a seat and crossing his arms. Anna held his gaze, feeling that the fear that usually overtook her in response to his words no longer had the same effect. Something within her had changed, and she knew there was no going back. "I just said what I think, Victor. It has nothing to do with bravery, only with what I feel," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady and without trembling. He laughed, a short, dry laugh with no hint of humor. "What you feel," he repeated sarcastically. "I wonder who's filling your head with nonsense, because you don't seem the same. You used to know your place, Anna. You were obedient, quiet, and you didn't question anything I said." Anna felt a mix of indignation and sadness. Was this how Victor saw her? As someone without her own voice, destined only to obey and remain silent? "Maybe that's what you wanted to see," she replied, looking at the breakfast she had prepared as if it were an excuse not to look at him. "But I've changed, and I'm not going to keep being the submissive woman that you and my family expect." Victor pressed his lips together, visibly irritated. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "And you think you can just change and everything will stay the same? You're not thinking straight, Anna. You know that without me, you're nothing. Or are you planning to just go out there and ruin the life we've built?" Anna looked at him, feeling that every word he spoke only strengthened her resolve. That life he spoke of had never really been hers. It had been a borrowed, controlled existence where her own identity had been buried. But now, she saw that she had the power to choose and to build something different. "I'm not going to ruin anything, Victor. I'm just starting to understand that my life belongs to me," she said, surprised by the calmness in her voice. "I've lived too long under your rules, under your conditions, but I can't keep doing that." He stood up suddenly, pushing his chair back, his hands clenched into fists. "Do you really think you can just walk away from this without consequences?" he said in a lower tone, but it was filled with anger. "No one is going to help you, Anna. You have nowhere to go. Without me, you'll just be a lonely, failed woman." Anna felt a sharp pain in her chest, but this time it wasn't fear. It was sadness for the love she had once thought was real and that now revealed itself as a means of control. However, she didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing how much his words hurt her. Instead, she used them as fuel to reaffirm her decision. "I don't care about being alone anymore," she said, with an unexpected peace. "I'd rather be alone than keep living a lie." Victor looked at her with an expression of disbelief, unable to comprehend how the woman he thought was completely subdued was beginning to raise her voice. He seemed about to say something else, but instead, he simply grabbed his things and left the house without another word. The slam of the door echoed throughout the house, leaving a heavy silence, but Anna felt a small victory within herself. Later, she sent a message to Laura to tell her what had happened. Her friend responded with words of encouragement, reminding her that she was by her side every step of the way. Anna felt stronger with Laura's support and decided to take the opportunity to reach out again to Marta at the association. In her next session, Marta greeted her with an encouraging smile. As she listened to Anna's story about the confrontation with Victor, she looked at her with admiration. "Anna, what you did takes a lot of courage," she said, her eyes full of empathy. "This is an important step on your journey. You faced your fear, and that's an enormous accomplishment." Anna took a deep breath, feeling the tension in her chest dissolve with every word from Marta. However, the concern about the future was still there, like a constant weight. "I know it's a step, but what comes next?" Anna asked with a trembling voice. "I feel like Victor won't just sit by. I'm afraid he'll try to do something to make me stay." Marta nodded with understanding and took out a notebook where she began to jot down information. "It's normal to feel that way, Anna. Psychological violence and control are very effective at keeping someone in a dependent situation. But now that you've decided to seek your freedom, it's important to establish a safety plan. We can help you create an environment where you feel secure and look for options if you decide to take a step further." Anna looked at her, feeling that each word she heard strengthened her hope. Marta explained the options she had and gave her recommendations on how to proceed safely, especially if she decided to separate from Victor and take a new direction in her life. "Remember, this is your decision, Anna. You don't have to do anything you're not completely sure of," Marta said, placing a hand on hers. "This process is yours, and you'll be ready when you decide." Anna nodded, recognizing that she needed time to process all these changes. But that clarity, knowing she was in control, empowered her like never before. It was a feeling that was beginning to turn into a tangible reality, into the possibility of a life she had never believed possible. On her way home, she allowed herself to imagine what life without fear would be like, where she could be herself, without having to answer to anyone. She walked through the streets with a lightness she hadn't felt in a long time, and for the first time in years, she felt able to look toward the future with hope. Upon entering the house, she found a note from Victor on the kitchen table. "You have no idea what you're doing, Anna. You'll regret it." But those words, which once would have instilled fear in her, now seemed like a final display of Victor's powerlessness. She had tasted the power of her voice, and she knew that he no longer had the absolute control he had always wielded. With the paper in her hand, Anna felt something break inside her, but this time it wasn't pain. It was the final release from the ties that had held her captive for so long. She walked over to the window, letting the fresh air fill the room, and for the first time in a long while, she took a deep breath, feeling how each inhalation brought with it the peace and hope she had longed for. This was just the beginning, but a powerful beginning. Anna looked at Victor's message on the table, his threatening words echoing in her mind like a distant whisper, yet they no longer intimidated her as they once did. She knew that every line in that note was a manifestation of his desperation to maintain control, proof that he was losing his power over her. She took a deep breath and left the paper on the table. She understood that responding would only reinforce his need to manipulate her, and instead, she chose to take a deeper step toward her freedom, a consultation with a lawyer specializing in cases of psychological abuse and separation. That afternoon, Laura accompanied her to Marta's office, where she had been referred to a trustworthy lawyer. While they waited in the lobby, Laura held her hand and gave it a comforting squeeze, as if reminding her that she was no longer alone. "You're doing the right thing, Anna. You fought in silence for too long," Laura said in a low, firm voice. "Now it's time for you to take what you deserve. peace, and dignity. Anna nodded, feeling a mix of relief and fear. She knew that taking the final step would mean a direct confrontation with Victor, and although she was no longer the same woman he had controlled for so long, she still feared what his reaction might unleash. But looking at Laura and remembering Marta's support, she knew there was no turning back. Finally, the lawyer appeared and invited them into his office. Sitting at the desk, Anna began explaining her situation to the lawyer, Jorge. As she spoke, she noticed how he nodded, listening attentively to every detail without interrupting her, as if he understood the magnitude of what she had endured. "Anna, I want you to know that you have very strong legal options," Jorge finally said, looking at his notes. "What you've experienced is considered psychological abuse and coercive control, and this can help protect you. We can request a temporary restraining order if you think it's necessary to ensure that Victor doesn't interfere or intimidate you during the process." Anna looked at Jorge, surprised to hear those words. The possibility of a restraining order seemed unreal, as if the mere idea of being protected from Victor was too hopeful. However, that hope was turning into something tangible, something that could change her life. Is it possible he would actually obey that order?" she asked in a doubtful tone, recalling the many times Victor had ignored any boundaries she had tried to set. Jorge nodded with a serious tone. "It's possible, Anna. If you decide to proceed, the system has resources to make sure he complies with the restrictions. I know this process is complicated, but what's important is that you know you can move forward. Every step you take is a victory toward your freedom and well-being." Laura squeezed Anna's hand, and she felt the weight of her decision turn into a promise of something better. It was a chance to close that chapter, to reclaim her voice, and though she felt afraid, she was also ready to face any difficulty that might come. After leaving the office, Laura and Anna walked in silence to a nearby park. They sat on a bench under the trees, and the sound of the leaves rustling in the wind seemed to fill the air with a new, almost liberating calm. "Anna, do you realize how far you've come?" Laura asked, looking at her proudly. "You've made giant strides. You're a different woman, and that's amazing." Anna looked at the ground, feeling her chest fill with emotions she had suppressed for years. She smiled, even as a tear ran down her cheek. It was a mix of sadness and relief, a moment of reconciliation with herself. "For years, I thought I couldn't do anything," Anna whispered, her voice barely a thread. "I convinced myself that the life I had was all I deserved. But now I understand that I have the right to be happy." Laura hugged her, and they both remained silent for a few minutes, letting the moment imprint itself in Anna's memory as a point of no return. That night, back home, Anna began packing some of her belongings into a small suitcase. It wasn't much, a few changes of clothes, some personal keepsakes, and her journal, the one she had filled with silent thoughts, unspoken words, and which now represented a vital piece of her liberation. She knew that when Victor returned, he would find the house empty and his words powerless. Hours later, Victor arrived and, not finding her, began sending her messages. The first ones were subtle, with a tone meant to sound conciliatory, almost like a veiled apology. But as he received no response, the tone quickly changed, turning into a parade of threats and demands. Anna read a few messages but didn't reply. This time, her silence was not submission, but strength. She knew that any response would only fuel his desire to control her, and this time, she wouldn't give him that power. Instead, she took a deep breath, set the phone to silent, and turned it off before going to bed. She slept deeply for the first time in years, feeling that each unanswered message was a symbol of her independence. The next morning, she met with Jorge again to formally file the restraining order request. Each step in the process reminded her of the reality of what she was achieving, breaking the cycle of abuse and making way for a life where fear would no longer be constant. Jorge explained that while the process might take time, there were ways to expedite the order if there was evidence of the imminent risk Victor posed to her. Days later, the day of the hearing arrived to decide on the restraining order. Anna sat in the courtroom, her nerves on edge, watching the door through which Victor would soon enter. Her lawyer had explained that her presence was not required, but he came anyway, probably hoping to intimidate her. When Victor saw her, he cast a look full of contempt, but Anna held her ground, ignoring his attempt to unsettle her. In front of the judge, she listened carefully to Jorge's words as he outlined the pattern of psychological abuse Anna had endured for years. As she listened, scenes from their life together passed before her eyes like fragments of a story she was finally ready to leave behind. Victor tried to defend himself, arguing that it was all a misunderstanding, that Anna was exaggerating, and that he only wanted what was best for their marriage. But the judge, listening attentively to every detail, did not seem convinced. Finally, the judge ruled in Anna's favor, granting her a temporary restraining order and prohibiting Victor from any direct or indirect contact. Upon hearing the sentence, Anna felt an indescribable relief. It was as if an invisible weight had lifted from her shoulders, and at the same time, a flame of hope ignited in her heart. As she left the courtroom, Victor tried to approach her, but the officers stopped him. Anna gave him one last look, a mix of compassion and firmness. There was no hatred in her eyes, only a new peace, the certainty that she had regained her freedom. When she arrived at Laura's house, who greeted her with a big smile and a tight hug, Anna understood that she had reached a point of no return. She had faced her greatest fears, and for the first time in years, she saw a clear path ahead of her. "How do you feel?" Laura asked, not letting go of her hand. Anna took a deep breath, looking at her friend with a genuine smile. "Free, Laura. I feel free." If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to leave a comment sharing how you felt after listening to it. If you've been through a similar situation of manipulation and deceit, I'd love to hear your valuable perspective. I would be honored if you leave a like, share the video with a friend or family member, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next surprising story that's appearing on your screen right now. We have guaranteed entertainment exclusively for you. See you in the next video.